have such a love and respect for OK Ethics and the board members who work very hard to make this organization not only operational but effective. And especially to Mary, who's taken up the mantle of responsibility of leading the organization. Thank you, Mary, for undertaking that. And thanks for this invitation, because I love talking. I'm a preacher and a lawyer, and so, the combination, 50 minutes just isn't enough. So in the next 3 hours that we have together, I want you to hopefully come away with some pocket wisdom, some things that you can take away. So you've got a copy here of my book. It's not a Pulitzer Prize nominee, and it's really a compilation of 3 parts, but we'll talk about that in just a minute, and then I'm going to, everybody's got to have a shtick, right? So one of my shticks is I throw candy often during my seminars, but I decided not to do that at lunches after I spoke to a human resource group in Stillwater, and I was rewarding somebody for participation. I threw them a candy, and it knocked over her tea onto her white suit. You know how much it costs to dry clean a white suit? I do. And then I was doing that at a sexual harassment seminar one time, and it was a 2-hour thing, and we took a break in the middle, and a lady came up to me and she said, "Mr. Priest, I don't like this candy thing you do." She said, it's just like, we're little dogs and we do a trick and you give us a reward. What do you think we are, trained animals? And I said, "No, ma'am, you're not trained yet, but if you come back for the second half, we'll get you there." And she walked out the back door and never saw her again. So the topic today is about character, and let's see, here we go. Many of you probably remember General Norman Schwarzkopf, also known as Stormin' Norman, and he was in charge of one of the Desert Storm operations many years ago. He was a very successful general, very successful man in life. We're going to come back to him at the end, but this is what General Schwarzkopf said. If you have to choose between competence or strategy and character, it's good to have both, but if you can't have both, choose character. And that's part of my thinking too. My philosophy is you got to have competence. Nobody wants to take their car to a garage mechanic that doesn't know how to fix it. But do you want to take your car to a garage mechanic who knows how to fix it but cheats you on the bill? Now, I'd rather have both. And so the competence part can be acquired. Many times we think the character part isn't something you can acquire, but one of my propositions is you can grow your character, and we'll talk about that as we go along. So there's a matrix here that talks about, it's kind of like the Covey, most important things, quadrant 2 stuff, about what do you do if you have people that have competence but no character. You ideally want your leaders especially, but everyone really in your organization to have both character and competence. Otherwise, they could be very dangerous if they're competent but have no character. So the book itself is divided into 3 parts. I came up with 21 leadership principles, and I've accumulated these over time. And the way it started, when I served at another nonprofit, I started doing things a little differently than my predecessor had and implementing some different policies, and people were kind of scratching their heads. And, what's this? Why are we doing this? Where's this guy coming from? And I thought, well, maybe it would be helpful if they kind of had an operational manual of my brain. And this is the way I think. So one of my principles is treat people like adults until they prove themselves otherwise. And so let's lead with policies that don't assume people are going to cheat, lie, and steal from us. Let's assume they're going to be honest. And then if they cheat, lie, and steal, let's deal with that. And so I started these principles back at that other organization, then I've kind of built them out since then. But there's just 21 different principles. They're real short. And it's just, I started with the idea that I want people to know kind of my base of operation. There really is a method to my madness, and I could be wrong about things, but there's a principle behind the kinds of things I do. And then the middle part we're going to talk about in more detail. It's the story of a character from the Old Testament literature. And then the last part is a podcast interview that I did with Dr. Nathan Meller of Strata Leadership. And we talked about character and kind of my background and how we got there. So I begin with this proposition in the book and in today's presentation. You are a leader. Now, you may not feel like it, you may not have a title that suggests that, but you have a sphere of influence. And if you think about it for a minute, people will start coming to your mind. Who do you have an influence over? Who do you speak into their life? Who look up to you? My mom kind of instilled this in me very early. When I was a little kid, she would send me out the door in the morning and she'd say, "Remember, Jimmy, somebody's always watching you." And I thought she meant she had spies. And I think she did, because she always knew the bad stuff I did before I got home. But what Mom was really saying is, in whatever situation you find yourself, you have the potential to be a leader if you live into it. And so I tell all of our people at Goodwill and really wherever I speak, think about your sphere of influence. You have a group of people. You may not have a title, but you've got a testimony. You've got something that people believe about you, and if you have strong character and good values, they will lean into that. And so I think that's a fundamental, foundational principle that we have to start with. We are leaders regardless of our title. So you may be wondering why I have this weird outfit on. Well, part of it's to keep your attention. And since I'm not throwing candy, I got to find, I'm desperate for anything that will grab you and draw you in. But we're going to talk about the example of a guy named Joseph. Now, some of you may be familiar. He's found in a big section of the Old Testament book of Genesis. You couldn't look him up in the phone book because nobody knows his last name. But he's the son of Jacob. He's got 11 brothers, and he lived a very interesting life. And throughout his life, regardless of the circumstances, he was a person of character. Now, sometimes we think integrity and character is kind of situationally oriented, and if I had the right opportunity, I don't know, would I make the right choices? If I were tempted beyond my ability. I remember going to Las Vegas one time. I was speaking to a national convention there, and how many of you have been to Las Vegas? Yeah. It's kind of a sensory overload, isn't it? So I was just like, wow, this is crazy. And of course, they put us up in a casino, and I was getting on the elevator, and an attractive young woman got on the elevator with me, and she gave me a business card. And as you might expect, what it was in the city of Las Vegas, it was an invitation for me to get an in-room massage. And so I gave her card back, and I had this moment where I thought, well, what are my principles? What's my opinion about this situation? And I knew what my principles were because my wife had told me before I left. And so I handed that card back. But I thought, here I am in a town, really nobody knows me. It would be easy to make a decision. So I have another talk that I give about checking your compass before you get lost in the woods. And that's why these principles of character and integrity and values is so important to decide ahead of time. You don't want to decide as your pen is poised over your IRS return, I wonder what my thoughts are about honesty with the government. I could really save a lot of money if I just rounded the corners on this a little bit. So you've got to check your compass before you get in the woods and make sure that you understand your values before you get in a critical situation. So I call this presentation in the middle part of my book, High on Success. Honor, integrity, grace, and humility. And I talk about these principles in a little more detail, but I want to tell you the story of Joseph. And I said, if you consulted the Old Testament book of Genesis, it'd be hard to miss him. He occupies the lion's share of the book of Genesis. And he's a really interesting guy. So this is the quick timeline of Joseph. If you can kind of see, he's we meet him early in his life, before age 17, because at age 17 he has a climactic event occur to him. And then he ends up going to Egypt. He's been kidnapped and sold into slavery by his brothers. Then he goes into Potiphar's house, who's his boss, his slave owner, and he does well there. And then he gets thrown in jail, but he does well there. And eventually he makes his way to Pharaoh's throne room, and then he really hits the jackpot. He is elevated to the number 2 person in all of Egypt. But his life is not a smooth trip to the top. So your life is probably like this. My life's been like this. It's not straight to the top, right? You have ups and downs, you have setbacks, you have crises. They could be physical, death in the family. It could be you got a job, but you find out you're not really built for that. You have setbacks, some of your own making. People often say, everything happens for a reason. And I always want to say, and sometimes the reason is you're stupid. In fact, a lot of times the reason is that you're stupid. You make bad choices, and then you live with the consequences. But sometimes we make good choices, and we don't get the reward we think we should get, right? We had a saying back in my law practice days, no good deed goes unpunished. And that can happen. So take it as gospel that there's going to be ups and downs in your life. And don't be discouraged when you're in a trough, because most likely you're going to come back up, and then you're going to go back down. And when those things stop happening, you know what it means? You're dead. So here's our friend Joseph, and he was his favorite. He was the favorite child of Jacob. He was the son of Rebekah, one of Jacob's 4 wives, and he was the favorite child. How many of you were the favorite child in your family? Yeah, I was, I know. I keep telling my sister that, but she doesn't believe me. And did you ever get something special that the other kids in the family didn't get? I keep telling myself that I was a favorite child, but every year at Christmas, we'd open all our gifts, and then there'd be one extra present for my sister. And we're like, that ain't fair. But what that started before I was born, my sister's 7 years older, they had forgotten to give her a present one time at Christmas, and when she was the only child. And so they brought it out late, and she kind of thought that was how Christmas was done. So she always got the extra present. Now, is that fair? No, that ain't fair. But Joseph was kind of in that same situation. He got the extra gift. So he got the coat of many colors. And you've probably seen there was a play or opera on Broadway or something, the Joseph in the Technicolor coat. Right? So it was a badge of honor. All the other guys had Levi jeans. They just had work clothes. They didn't have anything special. But Joseph was really proud of this coat, and so he wore it like the mantle of honor that it was. And he would, I can just imagine him saying, "Hey, bro, see my coat?" And rub it in a little bit. In fact, he did this a number of different times. He had dreams. He was a dreamer, and he would remember his dreams. Now, a lot of times I don't remember my dreams, and my wife never remembers her dreams, and she thinks when I'm relating my dreams to her, it's crazy. I asked her one time, I said, "Diane, in your wildest dreams, did you ever think you'd be married to me?" And she said, "Jim, you're not in my wildest dreams." So Joseph has these dreams that he's telling, and he says, "I had this dream, and all the wheat sheaves in the field were bowing down to mine, and mine was standing up." Well, that's not a great breakfast conversation. These guys are eating a bowl of Wheaties, and he tells the story, "Hey, I had this dream last night, And they're like, they're growling at him and throwing food at him. And then not too long after that, he has another dream. And he says, I had a dream that the moon and the sun and all the stars were bowing down to me. And his dad says, you mean not just your brothers, but your mother and I were going to bow down to you? No way. That's the point that we're talking about here with Joseph is that he showed honor. But this is a way that he did not show honor. And we'll come back to that. None of us are 100% perfect. All of us have chinks in our armor. And so even though David predominantly showed honor to his parents and to his brothers, this was an occasion where he did not. He should have just kept his mouth shut. Or as my mom used to always tell me, shut up every chance you get. So the principle that I want to focus on in this early stage of Joseph's life is honor. Honor is defined as showing respect to people even when they don't really deserve it. So his brothers, they were throwing food at him at the breakfast table, they were grousing about him, they were secretly plotting against him. And one day, Jacob says to Joseph, hey, your brothers are out tending the sheep in a faraway place. I want you to go check on them, make sure they're okay. And this isn't in scripture, but I'm thinking Joseph's going, hey, I don't know that that's such a great idea, Dad. Those guys don't like me. Why don't you send my young brother Benjamin? They kind of like him. He's the run of the litter. And he says, no, I want you to go. So Joseph goes, walking into a situation that he no doubt believed was dangerous. But he finds the brothers, and as he's coming, of course, what's he wearing? The coat of many colors. And they see him coming, and they go, here comes that dreamer. Let's kill him. And then one of the other brothers says, I've got a better idea. Let's put him in this pit, and then we'll sell him into slavery. Now, this guy's an entrepreneur. He's thinking, how can I make a profit out of this, not just kill this kid? So when he comes, they strip the robe off him, they throw him in the pit. Eventually, traders come through, and they're on their way to Egypt, and they sell Joseph into slavery. I don't think I've got a picture of that, but it's amazing. The photographers in the Old Testament were able to capture all this stuff. So they send him to slavery, and then to make sure they kind of wrapped up the corners of the package, they take his coat of many colors and they dip it in blood. And I'm sure that Joseph had his name ironed in the back, just like when my mom sent me out to camp, she always made sure my name was ironed into all my clothing so I'd get it back. And so they take it to Jacob, and they say, Dad, we found this. What do you think happened? And Jacob jumped to the conclusion that he'd been killed by a wild animal. And he was inconsolable. He cried. This was his favorite child, and now all he had was the bloody coat. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, Joseph gets sold to the number one guy in Pharaoh's ranks named Potiphar. And I don't think I'm going to put on all the outfit here, but we'll just go with this. So he becomes a slave in Potiphar's house. And at the beginning, he's given real menial tasks, but Potiphar realizes pretty quickly, whatever he entrusts to Joseph, it succeeds. And so he starts giving him more responsibilities. Kind of like if you have a star employee and they do really good on this first project, boy, you're going to give them more work and load them up. And so Potiphar trusts Joseph, and he elevates him so that he's eventually the number one slave in the pecking order in Potiphar's house. And the Old Testament says nothing was withheld from him except Potiphar's wife. That makes sense. But one day, Potiphar's wife decides she likes this young buck. He looks good. He's handsome. And so she starts propositioning him. How many of you have ever been propositioned by your boss's wife? It hadn't happened to me either. But I guess because I don't look like Joseph. And she's begging him. And it says in the literature, she was after him every day. Now, I'm pretty good at resisting temptation on a one-off. But if you're presented with a temptation every day, and maybe nobody would know, right? So finally, it kind of reaches, this one, he's getting sold into slavery. It reaches the point, I can't see this. All right, that's when they're telling Jacob that her son is dead. And he exercises integrity. Now, integrity is doing what you're supposed to do even when no one is watching. It comes from the root word integer. Remember middle school mathematics class, whole numbers? That's what integral means, and integer, and that's where we get the root integrity. It's the same regardless of the circumstances. So Joseph, one day, not only gets propositioned to her, but she grabs him by the coat. Has that ever happened to anybody? You notice this guy keeps losing coats, right? And he is so intent on running away from the temptation that he leaves her with the coat. And you know what the coat is? Exhibit 1. In the case of Potiphar's wife versus Joseph, attempted rape. And when Potiphar gets home, he doesn't get a trial. Now, I think, if I was his defense attorney, I think I could have gotten him off. I think I could have established she was the perpetrator of this crime, but he didn't have me. So he ends up in jail. And when he goes to jail, he's got some choices to make too. His reward for integrity is imprisonment. And you think, well, that ain't right. He did the right thing. Why should he end up in jail? No good deed goes unpunished. Sometimes you make the right choices, but the rewards don't come to you. So he's in jail, but he's not grumpy. If I were in jail, I guess that's the slide on integrity, doing the right thing when nobody's watching. If I were in jail, you know how I'd spend my time? Writing briefs. I would be in that prison library all the time, doing research, right? And I would be telling everybody, you think you got a bum deal? Let me tell you about my story. I did the right thing, and I ended up in jail. And I would be advocating for myself. But that's not what Joseph did. He starts doing the same thing in jail as he did in Potiphar's house. He starts out kind of small, no responsibility, and the jailer trusts him with a little bit, and he proves himself responsible, and he grows in responsibility, and pretty soon he's running the jail, except for the jailer. And the jailer's sitting back drinking mint juleps with his head, hands laced behind his head, and he's in charge of the whole jail, and he's in charge of going around making sure all the prisoners are doing okay. So he runs into two guys that were recently in prison, and one of them is the baker for the king, and one of them is the wine taster for the king. And you know how kings are. You probably had bosses like this. It doesn't take much to upset them, and they throw you in jail. And so something had happened with these guys that offended the king, and he threw them in jail. And one morning, as Joseph went around to talk with them, see how they were doing, they both had these long faces. They were depressed, and they had had dreams. Remember, Joseph's the guy with dreams, but he's also the guy that interprets dreams. He understands. And he said, what's the matter with you guys? Why the long faces? Well, we've had these dreams. We don't know what they mean. He said, well, tell them to me, and God will help me interpret the dreams. And so they're kind of eager, right? So the wine taster says, well, I had this dream where I was offering a cup of wine to the Pharaoh, and he took it. And he goes, well, that dream means you're going to be restored to your position. Oh, that's great. I'm out of here. And then he turns to the baker and said, how about you? What's your story? So, I had a bunch of bread, and it was on my head, and the birds came and ate the bread. And Joseph said, well, let me get back to you on that. Actually, he said, the good news for this guy is not the good news for you. That means the king's going to chop your head off pretty soon. And sure enough, both things came to fruition. And as they're going out the door, one to be beheaded and one to be restored to his position, Joseph said, and don't forget about me. When you get back to your position of power and influence, put in a good word for the king. And the wine taster, of course, said, you bet, and promptly forgot. So he's still in jail. And it goes on for another 2 or 3 years. He remains in jail until one day the Pharaoh has a dream. So let me loop back here to the story about talking with these guys. Grace is the ability to help other people and be concerned about them when you'd rather be talking about yourself. I think about what would I do in Joseph's situation. I'd be talking about how unfair my life had been. I was sold into slavery. I did the right thing at Potiphar's house. Now I'm thrown in jail. But instead of focusing on himself, he focuses on others, and he extends grace to them. And the wine taster gets restored, and he goes back to see the Pharaoh and forgets about Joseph. So one day, the Pharaoh has a dream. These people have a lot of dreams. And he has this crazy dream about fat cows. I was thinking about Bill Brom the other day. He was one of my clients. He would love to have a lot of fat cows. And this Pharaoh had a lot of fat cows, but then some skinny cows came up out of the river and ate the fat cows. Well, what does that mean? And so he was very troubled by it, and all of a sudden, the wine taster gives himself an Aggie high five. Oh. Some of you will get that a little bit later. He said, I remember a guy in prison. He interpreted my dream. Remember when I got restored? Maybe he could help you. And so they send word to the jail. They say, hey, bring Joseph up here. Joseph shaves and puts on his best prison garb. And he goes in there and he tells the Pharaoh what the dream is about. He said, you're going to have 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And if I were you, King, I'd stock up during the 7 plentiful years so that you got some coverage for the 7 bad years. And you ought to put somebody in charge of that. And then Joseph starts to return to prison, and Pharaoh says, you demand. Now, he didn't say it in those words, but that's the Jim Priest translation. He said, where could I find anybody that is more insightful and wise than Joseph? Let's make him the number 2 guy in the kingdom. He puts a ring on his finger. He gives him a scepter. He gives him a chariot. Now, he's risen to the top. In a foreign country, after being brought in as a slave, and then being falsely imprisoned, and then being forgotten about. Remember we talked about ups and downs. And yet, consistently throughout this, he shows integrity. He shows grace. He shows honor. And as he predicted, they have 7 fat cow years, and Joseph builds these storage facilities, and they fill them up, and now he's got a lot of grain. And not only for the people of Egypt, but he can sell it to people in other countries, like the country his brothers are in. So after he kind of becomes the kingpin of Egypt and amasses all this, the brothers get the word that, hey, Egypt's got some food. Let's go down there and get some. And we'll kind of collapse the story here. They go down to Egypt, but they don't know this is Joseph. They think he's dead or enslaved somewhere. And here he is, the kingpin of Egypt. And so they come up, we just want to buy some grain from you. And he said, well, I think you're spies. I think we're going to have to put you in prison. Oh, no. And long story short, he has to leave the room at one point to weep because these guys are still schemers. They're still trying to get, an advantage. And he finally gives them the grain, and they go back and they fill their families. He says, bring everybody home. Bring everybody to Egypt. Bring my dad. Tell him that I'm still alive. And so they do. And eventually the dad passes away, and these brothers are still scheming. And they said, I'm afraid now that Dad's gone, Joseph might remember all the bad stuff we did to him, throwing food at him at the breakfast table and selling him into slavery. We need to make up a story. And so they go to Joseph and they say, Dad told us before he died that he wanted you to forgive us and treat us like loving brothers. And I think Joseph knew that was a lie. But Joseph said these immortal words, am I in God's place? You meant it for harm, but God meant it for good, to save this nation and this family. And I take from that Joseph didn't get caught up in all of his power and glory. He understood he was not in God's place. And through all these circumstances, there had been a purpose. Not the kind of glib saying that, everything happens for a reason. Everything happened for a reason because he was faithful in his commitments. So humility is recognizing that you are not God, and there is a God. I had this poster up in my Sunday school classroom for a bunch of years, and you've met people in your spheres that thought they were God. I heard a comparison one time years ago. They said, the difference between God and a federal judge? The difference is that a federal judge, God does not think he's a federal judge. And sometimes you get that impression from judges or other lawyers or people. But humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less often and orienting yourself toward others. And I've come to believe, and this was confirmed by Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, which found that the CEOs of the good to great companies, the people that had a good company, but they really took it up to another notch, the most common characteristic of those CEOs was ambition, drive, cunning. It was humility. And when I read that, I did a double take. Really? Humility. And I think that's got to be the foundational value for all leadership. It doesn't mean that you go, oh, I'm not very good. That's not really humility. We had a lady at our church years ago. She used to sing solos, and she had a nice voice, but she was never good enough. You come up and you say, Kathleen, that was a great song you sang this one. Oh, no, I wasn't in very good voice. I was scratchy. And I, even as a teenager, I wanted to say to her, would you just say thank you? Leave it at that. I don't need to know. People didn't even know if she had a sore throat, but she thought she was being humble, but she was really drawing more attention to herself. So back to Norman, Storm and Norman. You want to have competence and you want to have character, but if you have to do without one, go with character. And I thought, well, I've got a great impression. I don't know, never met Norman Schwarzkopf, but I have a great impression of him. And so I did a little research on him, and I came up with this quote. And one of his lifelong friends said, this is the Norman that I knew. Let's see if I can go over here to read it. He said, Schwarzkopf was competent, compassionate, egotistical, loyal, opinionated, funny, emotional, sensitive to any slight. At times, he could be an overbearing bastard, but not to me. And I thought, this is the guy that was saying, you got to have character. And it reminded me that none of us are pure vessels. Norman had some deficiencies. He understood the importance of character. He didn't always live it out. And so that's what we're trying to do, is close the gap between head knowledge and heart knowledge. It's always the longest 12 inches in the world between your head and your heart. I know the right thing to do. Am I going to do it? Am I going to align my actions with my values? So I think the takeaway comes from Horace Greeley. He's an interesting guy. He was back in the 1860s. He established the New York Tribune. He was at one time a presidential candidate. He's kind of a grumpy guy in many ways. But I have this quote in my bathroom next to my mirror to remind me, fame is a vapor, popularity is an accident, and riches take wings. The only thing that endures is character. And I'm hopeful when I die, that's what people will remember about me. I've thought there's 3 core values in my life. I'd like those etched on my tombstone: integrity, enthusiasm, and encouragement. I want to live by those 3 values. And they're the things that keep me in line, and I try to align my actions with my beliefs. So back to who's a leader? Anybody a leader in this group? Every hand should be raised. You have the seeds of character. And you may think, well, I couldn't have done what Joseph did. He just seemed to be without fault. But at one point in your life, you have shown grace to someone who didn't deserve it. You have honored someone. Even if you don't feel like a person of integrity, there have been instances in your life where you've shown integrity in a difficult spot. And you've been humble, at least a couple times in your life. So don't criticize yourself that you're not perfect. You're like Norman Schwarzkopf, right? He believed about character. He preached about character. He didn't always live it out, but he was trying. And I think that's the takeaway for us, is to make sure that we align our values. After we've defined them, define, align, assess, and progress. When you fall down, get up. One of my favorite verses in the Old Testament is, a righteous person falls down 7 times and yet gets up. I thought righteous people didn't fall. But the Bible says righteous people fall down sometimes, but they persist. And I've come to believe it's not perfection, it's persistence. So figure out your values, align your conduct with it, and you'll find out, I think, that leadership really comes down to an inside job. So with that, I will stand for cross-examination, and if you ask an intelligent question, you could get a copy of my book for free. Now, let me define an intelligent question. It's one I know the answer to. It makes me look good. So if you do that, or if you make a thoughtful comment, and a thoughtful comment will be judged by your peers. If they think you're just pandering for a book, you don't get it. But if they think it's a good, legitimate comment, then you could get a book for free. All right, questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
So obviously, as a pastor as well as a lawyer, how do you walk that line in your business lives, where you live out your Christian values without getting into trouble with your employees?
Yeah, I'll take my prison hat off here. When I was growing up, oh, the question, yeah, I'll repeat the question. How do I figure out how to integrate being a preacher and a lawyer? And I'll tell you a quick story. I was on the path to seminary at one point, thinking I was going to be a pastor. But I decided, after being exposed to some different classes at college, I think I really want to be a lawyer. And both of them are advocates. And so I kind of made a pivot and was pursuing law, but I was still doing some preaching on the side. So it was a little country church. I was filling in for the pastor who was on vacation, and a little old lady came up to me afterwards and she said, "Mr. Priest, that was a wonderful sermon. You're going to make a wonderful minister." I said, "Well, thank you, ma'am, but I'm going to be a lawyer." And she kind of dropped her jaw and she said, "Why are you going the other way?" So I would say I've spent most of my career trying to convince people I really didn't go the other way. I viewed law as ministry. I was helping people. I was helping solve problems. But I try not to hammer people with my own personal faith. And I try to be a bridge. And that's my trail name that was given to me by Nathan. I try to bridge between people who have faith and people who don't have faith, between the business community and the church community, between Democrats and Republicans. I'm not doing too good on that. Hopefully that gets close to an answer for you. Oh, you get a book. All right, Mr. Hoxie.
I just thought
Oh, yeah, you're reminding me. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, other thoughts or questions? Any objections that I can overrule? All right, Miss Mary, back to you. Thank you.